Why do you think it's wrong to attribute China's economic success to the opening of its markets?
Of course, markets was pivotal. The reform and opening up was really the impetus to the next few decades of growth in China. But if we think about the fact that China was the fastest growing country for the longest period of time in all of human history, and being that big, well, it wasn't enough just to for markets to work and for markets to open up. That would have taken very slowly. If you think about the Western markets, it really took hundreds of years to perfect. And so with that accelerated growth and really going after, investments, industrialization, and urbanization, the state had a helping hand rather than a grabbing hand, as some would say.
What drove you to write the new China Playbook?
US and China relations are increasingly fraught, and there's a lot of chill in the air, and it's becoming more dangerous. And I have had the benefit of having a bi-educational background, bicultural. I know the US very well, China very well. I went to the US at a very early stage, and it seems that the misunderstandings and misgivings between the two countries are not only still there, but they have increased and widened, even though China became a more open and a richer country that more people had visited. I was puzzled by the fact that very sophisticated Americans had a very little knowledge about China, and I was frustrated that the U.S. imposed one particular lens to look at China, as it often does with other countries as well. But when you talk about U.S. China, it is the most essential relationship of the century, and you have to get it right. And we have to work tirelessly to even contribute a little bit to each other's understanding. My book is about telling China's truth, demystifying some long-standing misunderstandings, and bridge the two countries and give an inside perspective on what China is like, warts and all, but not quite as the Western media depicts it.
You're a Chinese citizen yourself and you were educated in China for the early part of your childhood, and then you went to the US for your higher education. What was it like to straddle between the Eastern and Western cultures?
I think I benefited so much from the Western education and from the Chinese education. I think that the best is really the combination of the two worlds. The Chinese with the disciplinary uh, uh, environment, the competition, which is so essential when you're young, and that drive to excel. The West's education is also supremely liberating, right? The time I got to the US high school, I was really puzzled that the first lesson we had, or in the first class, history class, my teacher asked us to question authority, to question textbooks. Oh, that was a very foreign and alien concept to me, and to have an open mind, to not pass judgments so easily. These were really essential values above and beyond what you're taught in the textbooks. And you can use a type of framework to analyze the world. And of course, that was supremely eye-opening. But a little bit ironic is that many years later, a couple decades later, the U.S. universities and U.S. school environment has gone the opposite way of being less open-minded, being more judgmental, and having less opportunities really say what you think. But nevertheless, the US education is completely different from the Chinese education. I really think it emphasizes a lot on unleashing your own potential and taking your own initiative. China is focused on problem solving, and hence, they have really great engineers, and reverse engineering is great as well. Of course, China is being very, very innovative. So, because the entrepreneurs and the people are very innovative, I think the education system really requires a combination of both the discipline and imaginations, and the textbooks and the training versus the creativity and the initiative. If you hear me, you hear American. And I think it's impossible to rub it off because the culture is so dominant. And I'm very grateful for that American drive and spirit in the workplace, the aggressiveness in the seminars, but in a very um, in a very valuable way. I actually think the US and the Chinese have a lot more in common than they pretend to have. And both cultures are very family oriented, very driven, very competitive. They like to win and they really value hard work. That's really, really important. It's an important place for young people to start their journeys, their careers off. And this is why some of the best business unions have been US China. And they can do so much together. They can really dominate the world together. But, they choose not to. They choose to fight each other. And then other countries give other countries a chance, which is also unintendedly not a bad thing for other countries. But the two values are very similar. In contrast to Europe, which is struggling from low productivity, from a lack of entrepreneurial dynamism. All the talent is moving away from Europe. It's very hard to scale up a business here. And sometimes business success is not as celebrated as it was the case in China and the US. Of course, China is actually starting to head somewhere between Europe and US. China used to be like US, or China and US had very similar degrees of competition and celebrating success, and rewarding people for their hard work and innovation, while China is now going somewhere in between US and China, and Europe on social issues. And that's a preference, that's a policy choice. I don't want to pass a judgment on whether that is good for growth or bad for growth, but that is the path that it is at least currently choosing.
One of the things that you've discussed quite often is that China seeks to be an upgraded or improved version of Germany. What do you mean by that?
I think that if you look at the history of the modern Chinese economy, and certainly in the last 30 odd years, China has chosen the path of industrialization rather than developing its service sectors. And China is the absolute dominant manufacturing power in China, in the world, hands down. It is larger than the next 9 countries' manufacturing output combined. And a lot of that is going to exports, although less of it is going to exports because China is becoming big. How did China become such a dominant power in such a short period of time? Well, it was, first of all, the right policies, but it started from a preference for making stuff, making industrial goods, and China excelled at that. And even today, currently, as the world is moving a little bit away from just manufacturing output and industrialization, China still believes that making real things, right, real products, is more, let's say, real than the knowledge and financially driven, property driven economy like the US. So it prefers to be a bigger, smarter Germany in the sense that you're utilizing the latest emerging technologies like AI and robotics to still dominate manufacturing, climb up the value chain, rather than focus on, let's say, the real estate agents, the property developers, the lawyers, the IP, intellectual property, which defines the U.S. It is purely a preference.
Talking about industrialization, one of the things that we can't forget to talk about is the role of SOEs in China's economic miracle. So I think if you look at how the traditional economists view SOEs, they would, label them as inefficient, and that the best way to approach them is to probably get rid of them altogether. After all, they are venues and spaces for crony capitalism. Are they wrong?
People do misunderstand a great deal about SOEs. SOEs' main objective is not just profit driven. They don't act purely like a private public company that aims to maximize the value of its shareholders. Instead, they bear a lot of social and economic national responsibilities. And so one can't purely judge them based on economic and financial efficiency. If Beijing wants to, build an Olympic park, who does that? SOEs bear the brunt of the burden. Long time ago, when China had very little technology, who was in charge of carrying forward China's national innovation strategy? It was the SOEs. Now, of course, the private sector has thrived and they have taken it over, but back then it was the SOEs. When the financial crisis hits 2008, 2009, who bears the burden of um, resuscitating the economy, saving the stock market? SOEs. So SOEs have a broader set of objectives than private enterprises and the private sector. But as SOEs have been also increasing their efficiency over time. They're not the clunky old dinosaurs that one imagines of the planned economy. They are actually very competitive. They obviously have a lot of resources, and they have successfully gone overseas, starting with the state banks, but many others. But they're also just mainly concentrated in the strategic sectors and the resources sectors where a country believes needs to have more state influence, state dominance, or state control. As to whether they are dominating too much these days, I mean, there are some mixed views. I think the data suggests that they're becoming a bit more dominant than they were in the past few years. But at the same time, I do think that it is also focused on a few strategic sectors. If you look at broadly at manufacturing or service industries, obviously, this is not where the SOEs play the biggest role. Are they still going to be around and wield very big influence? Of course they are. They are also that's also the case in many countries, including France and Brazil. But do they necessarily crowd out the private sector? That's I think that's more debatable. But also, if you look at a very interesting phenomenon, they um, they are now equity stakeholders of private companies. So in this business network, which connects all the universe of Chinese firms, they are often a shareholder of some of the most productive, best private companies. And in some cases, they do offer some help, assistance. So it's good to be connected to a central or local SOE. It's a more complex situation than we imagine, not one suppressing the other, but being all part of a same network. And if you're in the same network, then you can actually benefit from having a state SOEs as an equity stakeholder.
I see. But at the same time, I think in China, especially in the 90s, SOEs were highly inefficient, and many of them actually did slow down the economy. I remember in your book, you wrote about Premier Zhu Rongji. Under his time of leadership, he had this idea and concept called grasping the big and letting go of the small. How did that help China reform its SOEs?
Every time there was an economic downturn or major crises, at least in the last 40 years, the government came out and did something, enacted some very drastic reforms to give the economy a boost, and they were very successful. And in the late 90s, the SOEs were doing very badly, and that was impinging on the state banks with a lot of non-performing loans. And the Chinese government decided to undertake SOE reforms also as a to pave the path for the accession of China to the WTO, which needed a lot of SOE reforms and more market-driven disciplines. And their strategy was to consolidate some of the SOEs that was worth saving or that pursued particular objectives, and to let go of some of the smaller ones and the loss-making ones. And once these reforms were undertaken, you really had radically fewer number of SOEs run in a more efficient manner. Some even having more monopolies in certain areas, although that not necessarily is not a good thing, but it also raised profitability. You saw that the productivity gap between the SOEs and the private sector started to close because the productivity levels of the SOEs were rising very quickly. So I'd say that that was a very, very successful reform, and just the sheer drastic reduction of the sheer number of SOEs and their influence meant that more resources could be released to the private sector, and that also um, kind of initiated a wave of greater competition and drive for the private sector.
If you just look at the consumer application economy, that many of the top American downloads are actually Chinese apps. If the state has such a huge role in managing or controlling the economy, then how did such dominance of Chinese private sector efforts that not only just begin to flourish in China, but manage to become global? How did that phenomena emerge?
I think the misunderstanding is that the state wields a really heavy hand on the economy. We have to be a lot more nuanced and a lot more specific about what we mean about in that sense. The state can wield a very important influence on the economy when it comes to, let's say, interventions in the stock market or major policy directional moves, setting the country up for a new path or changing the rule or even the law to kind of alter the path of certain entrepreneurs and businesses. Yes, in that way, it does wield a much radical and much heavier but also faster hand in some sense. But they're not micromanaging. And one thing that was emphasized in my book is it's political centralization. Yes, centrally these leaders have a lot of power, but the success was brought about by economic decentralization. And that means figuring it out at the local level, implementing these good policies at the local level. And there's a lot of leeway given because the local governments are really on the ground. They're sensitive to the developments of the local economy, and they give a lot of space and a lot of air to, and a lot of resources, frankly, to the local companies. So, when we talk about a heavy state, yes, you can say that, yes, on the positive, there were 4 million EV charging stations built in a very short period of time, new digital infrastructure built, this so on and so forth. On the negative, you can say that too many interventions, manipulations of, let's say, prices or interest rates or exchange rates or whatever it is, too many state interventions. But if you look at the businesses, they're the most innovative and dynamic and competitive in the world. Why? Because at the local level, there was a lot of room to develop. And in fact, the local governments actually helped the private enterprises, right? Because it was good for them. It was a win-win situation. You have good, promising entrepreneurs, you get more tax revenues, greater GDP, you climb up the political ladder, your real estate is worth more, you have things to brag about to your neighboring cities and provinces, and you need to rely on the good businesses. So they're actually they're bending their backwards for to help these private entrepreneurs. Even today, as the economy goes into a major slump, they're knocking on the doors of entrepreneurs all the time, saying, "How can we help?" Often, it's not the money they give because there's limited amount of money that they can give to businesses, but just coordination. Okay, talking to the banks, coordinating the different businesses, supply chain, coordinating the lenders versus the borrowers. That is enormous amount of help that goes way beyond what markets can give you. So it's a mistake to think that China is just a state-heavy dominant economy. Otherwise, how did 20, 30 million private companies spring from nowhere?
And I think what you're alluding to is actually your discussion of the mayor economy, where mayors actively serve as a form of political entrepreneur to attract investment. And that's a model I think we're quite familiar with even in Singapore, where we've seen public servants really play that role of making Singapore conducive for foreign direct investment or investments from local companies. On that note, there's another question that I had relating to the mayor economy, which is that there are certain upsides as we see, but what about the perils of having a mayor economy?
Yes, there's a lot of similarity with the entrepreneurial state in Singapore and in some others. But I'd say that because China's so big, there was an additional challenge, which is how can you get all the cities and provinces to do the same and still not have chaos brought to them, right? Brought onto the country. In fact, that mechanism, that competition, the yardstick competition among the mayors, among the provincial governors was absolutely essential to the uh, uh, as a apparatus of competition and checks and balances, right? Because if you are a company and you're in a place where with a heavy-handed local government that is not supportive or even or even extracts your values, then you can just simply flock to another province, right? That was really, really, really important, essential as a checks and balances. And that I think differs a lot from the more, state dominant places in other countries, centralized places in other countries where the government is very extractive. You do that, and then all the good companies will flock away. So that provides a level of check. And also competition among the provincial governors also means that to some degree, there's restraint, there's constraint. China obviously is not a Western style democracy, but there are very important competitive mechanisms and accountability mechanisms within the system that I think the outside world fails to appreciate. Um, but the mayor economy, I think, really only works for a period of time, and that is in the early stages of development where lots of macro, legal, rule of law uh, framework has not been set up, financial, and not yet mature. The market is eventually supposed to work on its own. Obviously has disequilibrium times and crises and fluctuations, but before you get there, there's a long way to go before you can make this a mature system. And along the way, if you don't have the state enabling the private sector, enabling the private entrepreneurs, it will take a very, very long time. Or a lot of these benefits will go to a very disproportionate few, just like in the case of Russia and some European countries, where you have a radical shift to a market-driven economy, and that wasn't China's path. China chose gradualism, but that also meant that the state had to play a bigger role. Now, the mayor economy had the downsides, and we're seeing some of that now. The vast accumulation of debt, local government debt in particular, a lot of which is actually still hidden. Um, Gradually brought to the fore, potentially a lot of waste because, does the government really know how to allocate efficiently its resources? Does it really know how to pick winners? And so there was a lot of learning along the way, although I do have to say that the learning curve is pretty steep, and the local government in the new round of supporting technology, high-tech companies, according to many experts in the field, have said they have also become experts themselves, and they're very cautious about how to allocate resources, how to engage, and they actually pick the fund managers to help them choose which companies they should support. So it's obviously a learning curve, but debt, this massive kind of very, very obsessive pursuit of GDP growth to the point of hurting the environment, causing dislocations, and building buildings one after another. Think about the real estate. Obviously, that was definitely partly a consequence of the mayor economy. That was the fastest way to get GDP and to get investment, and a lot of inefficiencies. But at the same time, look at China's results, right? Yes, there are side effects, there are disequilibrium, but it grew very rapidly. It became one of the most innovative superpowers, and especially on the technology front, the same thing. You couldn't have done it without the local government support for these private entrepreneurs. The kind of companies that you were talking about, Shein, Alibaba, Temu, all of that, nobody was um, too far from the local government's, first of all, observation, but also they needed to manage these relationships. Of course, they did it on their own, but it would have been impossible in a country without a clear set of rules and regulations and very mature financing to have achieved all.
You make this analogy in your book. China is like a child wearing oversized clothes. That the child is young and cannot fit into the clothes right now because it's still immature. As it grows, the child will eventually fit into those clothes. My follow-on question would then be, what would a mature China look like in about 30 years' time?
Again, it's also a preference, right? Does it want to be more like Europe, overregulated? but kind of safe, if you will, if not suffocating? Or does it wanna look like the US? Very decentralized, very little state governance, some proper regulations in place, but probably not enough, and extreme wealth accumulated in the hands of few, um, uh, with, uh, uh, with frequent eruptions of, major consumer, protection issues or, kind of, social, inequity issues. Can it tolerate that, right? So it's not just a matter of going somewhere, it's a matter of where you exactly wanna go, and I think where China stands now, at least from where I'm seeing now, it is trying to balance economic and social issues rather than just putting economic efficiency, financial, greatness, wealth, accumulation as, the most important objective, in China. It seems to care a lot more about, consumer protection, data protection, driving out the unequal parts of or unfair parts of inequality and making sure that the citizens are well looked after. Now, that is the ultimate goal. Whether it will be delivered or not, I believe, still depends on how good the economy fares, because that's where the resources are. You want the pie to be big enough to divide the pie. So where it would look like, I'd say that it would look somewhere in between. I think that, the kind of explosive growth of the last 15 years is gonna be increasingly more difficult, for major, companies, of major valuations in a very short period of time to, grow without restraint, right? Growth without restraint, is gonna be tougher. But China's not gonna look like Europe because the people still are driven, they wanna work hard. It's a big market. We gotta fix the financial system so that good, innovative companies can raise money. That's essential, and China has to stay open. So the institutions would look like, really, I call it beyond socialism and capitalism. It's going to be a combination of a lot of regulations, but having the basic infrastructure and institutions in place to unleash that potential. Of course, better rule of law. Of course, better intellectual property protection. Of course, China needs a much more robust bankruptcy law. China needs to broaden and deepen its financial system with the right rating agencies, credit agencies, insurance companies, the whole gamut of the proper institutions to work together and coordinate. But that's going to take a long time. So again, we saw explosive growth when a lot of things were pretty gray. And now part of it is more regulation, more rules, and less of that really rapid growth, but probably more inclusive growth, hopefully.
One of the statistics that you cite is that there is zero correlation between China's financial market performance and its economic growth rate. So in a certain sense, it points us towards the fact that the fundamentals of the company is not reflected in the financial performance on the stock market. You have this paradox where China is one of the best performing economies in the world, but at the same time, it is one of the worst performing financial markets in the world. What do you think explains this paradox?
Yes, some researchers found that the correlation in most advanced economies, which generally above 50%, economic growth with stock returns, and in China, same bucket as in India or Iran, was close to zero. And that means that the stock market didn't reflect the fundamentals of the Chinese economy. And I went in great length in explaining why, based on other people's scholarship and research. And part of the reason, I think, is that the stringent criterion to list on the Chinese market means that a lot of companies will choose less than optimal strategies, okay, to list, right? And actually, the companies that prefer to list abroad were fine. They were, their performance was very highly correlated with fundamentals, but the ones that were listed domestically were not. Often they would forego long-term strategic objectives to pursue short-term goals in order to be listed. But also another thing is that, again, coming back to our view that the stock market is not a very mature system. The financial system is not yet mature. Chinese companies were doing a lot of very bizarre things once they get listed or in preparation to get listed. They start acquiring lots of companies that have nothing to do with their core business. They start to really invest in real estate, even as a non-real estate related company. They start to do these things. Pharma companies acquiring golf clubs and soccer clubs or whatever it is. So it was just a mess, really, like a huge chaotic playground where lots of people come together to exploit the system. And no wonder, without the proper rating agencies and accounting firms that are actually held accountable, there were a huge amount of corporate governance issues in China. China being so entrepreneurial, Chinese people being so entrepreneurial, are able to find these small loopholes to a bunch of very bizarre things. So I think that just comes back to our previous notion that the system is not yet mature with the proper regulations and framework in place.
Yeah. I asked my friend from China to explain this phenomenon. Why was, for example, I think like in your book, you said why Evergrande was going into cars, soccer clubs, and even pig farms. And she said that, if profit maximizing was your goal, then you don't really care about what your core business is. You're just trying to find whatever can give you the most profit. And maybe that is what kind of drives this behavior.
If you think about why the West now is so focused on business values, right? Sustainability, long-termism, inclusiveness. Well, they've had that period of recklessness. They've had that period of chaos and lack of restraint. And it has impinged on society and ultimately the business themselves. But China's still starting that cycle. It's not as if countries really learn from each other and companies really learn from each other's past mistake. We have to we have to admit that people just don't study history or they don't internalize the historical experiences and lessons of others to do better. They just don't. This is why countries will always repeat that cycle. Chaos, lack of governance, lack of corporate governance, lack of proper values. And then eventually they realize actually these are really important for the long term. China is still the short, flat, fast attitude. Although in the last few years, things are starting to change. But look at the West, they're still trying to figure that out despite having many, many more decades of experience, right?
One of the Rorschach tests that I've been paying attention to is this response to Chinese government crackdown on the tech companies like Alibaba and also to a smaller extent the tuition agencies. I think a lot of commentators from the West tend to see this as a form of government overreach. But I think you probably have a different take from them.
Well, think about why Donald Trump became so popular, even in the tech sector in the US, because probably the tech sector, um, was substantially affected by Biden's regulations and outlook on the technology sector. This is not a new thing, right? Regulating big tech, protecting consumers, the issue of data. It's a global thing, and it's especially espoused by the Western countries, except they keep on talking about it rather than doing something. And China decided to do something, although one can argue that there were technocratic errors and it wasn't well formulated so that it impinged on the economy as a whole. But the intentions or the initiative or the root causes of these things is really very much a global issue. And I think that one needs to think about these issues, given that big tech is becoming more dominant and will be even more dominant with the greater adoption of AI. Now, I think that the easy answer or the most straightforward answer to your question is, for a long period of time, China was absolutely engrossed by economic objectives. And that has caused a huge amount of wealth inequality, but also inequity in society. Again, the typical story. Um, then there are new areas that really defies regulation or doesn't even have proper regulation, like fintech, right? Uh, is Ant financial technology company or is it really a financial firm? And is it subject to the same regulations and parameters as a bank as it was doing ongoing banking activities? So I believe that these unanswered questions deserve to be raised. Although maybe, whether what exactly was done could have been much better, much smoother, and have protected a number of shareholders and been beneficial for the broader economy. But these are the unknown territory. And so my more subtle answer to your question is that it was an exploration of how to balance the great powers of technology and technological firms with delivering benefits to society as a whole, but also ensuring that consumers get properly protected. Now, if we look at China's case, there were so many cases of fraud, of exploitation, as we all know on the internet level. People died because of the lack of, consumer data protection and manipulation. Again, not a universal issue. And the government, which was focused on social issues, sometimes even more than economic issues, decided to crack down on these things. But also, if you wanted to be a bit more, cynical about politics, you can also say that China is a place where capital does not rise above politics like in the US. It's the other way around, right? Politicians like to control capital, rather than capitalists controlling politicians. It wants to be the opposite of the US. It wants an olive-shaped society in terms of income distribution, fat in the middle and narrow on the top. It's a bunch of choices. And I think I am empathetic to certain kind of concerns, including gaming and how much you allow your children to be on the internet and social media. I mean, there's huge amount of work done now on how social media has harmed teenagers and young people, maybe to the point of no return. And these issues were addressed faster than other countries in China. Was it done in the right way? There's a doubt about that. Did it impinge on the economy? I think so. Could it have been much better done? Absolutely. But it's not as if it's just some hand just falling down and without the right kind of goals. But coming back to the companies, I think entrepreneur is absolutely essential for China. There's no doubt about it. The private sector drives the whole country's innovation and supports the majority of the country's jobs. The state needs the private sector to thrive. Now, how do you balance these social issues and while not forsaking growth and productivity and efficiency is an extremely hard problem that no country with the exception of a handful of smaller economies in Northern Europe have figured out. Right. So I think we need to be more clear-minded about that. But the last thing I would say is that I think it's a learning curve. It's a lesson for the Chinese government. I think that they will be more careful about coming out with regulations and new rules going forward. I think communication is absolutely essential. Transparency is essential. Helping, the companies, the private sector for a smoother transition is absolutely essential. And I'd say that right now, the current focus is back on the economy rather than the wider debate about social issues. Hopefully, they can find a balance of the two. But as we've seen, it's very difficult.
Yeah, I think in Singapore, we're only a population of 5 million people, and these issues are already very contentious. So I can imagine at the scale of a billion plus people, how much harder it is to govern. So I think in a certain sense, as in a small city state, we can appreciate that the infinite complexities you have to face as you scale up your, I guess, regulatory environment. On the topic of education, I wanted to talk about the one-child policy. One of the interesting statistic I gleaned from your book was that Chinese households spend up to 25% of their income on their kids' education. And that's 5 times of what the Americans spend. So this was apparently an unintended consequence of the one-child policy. What is the impact of the one-child policy on China's economy today?
The one-child policy is one of the most controversial, radical social programs that China has ever had, although population was spiraling out of control. And of course, the environmental, economic, political implications of that were going to be real. But I mostly discuss about the unintended consequences of the one-child policy. And on the one hand, it was, of course, sad that families could not have more than one child, despite the fact that they desire to have more than one child. But because of this one-child policy, parents were much more focused on investing in this one child's education. We in economics call the quantity-quality trade-off. Reduce quantity, raise quality. Okay, that makes children seem like a commodity, but that's how we think about these issues. Also, very funnily, we in there's is children a consumer good or an investment good, right? And so the Chinese parents, if I can put it in very unemotional, unhuman terms, was almost like an investment good where because you had only one of them, you wanted to bet on the success. And so I think that it led to a huge amount of education companies exploiting that parents' anxiety. It led to a huge amount of national angst over competition for schools and competitions for academic excellence. And who bore that responsibility or who bore the pain? Well, part of it is the children who had many, many extracurricular activities, including tutorials. And it was borne by the parents who, many of whom emptied their bank accounts to educate this one child. That national angst eventually led to some of the discussions we had before on the issues of cracking down educational companies, because when the nation is filled with anxiety and suffering because of the competitive educational backgrounds, the government was going to do something about it. On the brighter side, I do think that it led to a much more accelerated um, excellence and benefit for women, because daughters used to be educated only after the sons. And now, well, guess what? There's only one child. So you put everything on that one child, be it a girl or a boy. And all the statistics have shown that girls have really excelled. The gender gap for higher school education attainment closed. In fact, girls are doing better than boys. And even if you look at the outcomes, including the gender gap for let's say running businesses and CEOs, girls who were born after the one-child policy had a higher, much greater likelihood of becoming a leader than the previous generations. So I think all of this is true and really raised the status of women. Now, ironically, as the one-child policy has now drastically turned around to becoming has many children as you possibly can kind of strategy, it's actually been less good for women, where much of the workplace have worried about women in the workforce because now they can have more than one child. Now, again, this comes back to the issue of values, right? Not enough emphasis on social, business, core sustainability issues, values in businesses. And so that's become a reverse effect for women. But I think that more broadly on a societal level, it was absolutely, momentous, this program, because it changed the family fabric, right? On the one hand, it did give more equality between the generations. It was so hierarchical before, parents, grandparents dominated the children. Now, parents are looking up to their children. It broke that, but it also, I think, changed the value of having a bigger family, of what family means. And so, as we study some of the economic aspects of this, there were some really important social consequences that also interact with economics. So, I think this is one of the most fascinating subjects to study, and of course the psychological impact on the children and so forth, and why China is having such a low fertility level currently has a lot to do with the policy that was implemented many decades ago.
On a side note, I have to add that in Singapore, we have Chinese students that come over to study from the secondary school level all the way to our university. And they are highly, highly competitive. So I remember in secondary school, uh, when a lot of these Chinese students started coming in, they didn't speak English. And by the time they finished their time at school and they finished the O levels, they already got an A1 for English. So I think there is a certain strength in the Chinese education system. And on that note, it might be worth asking, so much investment in education in China. Do you think China has the human capital to become one of the world's leading, if not the most innovative economy?
I'm trying to grapple with some of these issues. There's a tension here, right? Which is if you have an education system that is focused too much on just academic excellence, exam taking, and discipline, it also leads to very robotic thinking, and it often suppresses a lot of the natural creativity and drive and initiative that these very talented Chinese students have. They do become great engineers and problem solvers, but can they actually identify the problem themselves or create new problems to challenge and, do these breakthroughs, what I call my book, 0 to 1 innovations rather than 1 to N applications-driven innovation. On the other hand, if you look at, a place like the US, I think a lot of the talent is also wasted because there was not enough training and skilling up and discipline in the early years. So again, coming back to my view that the combination of both would be the more perfect model. But we got to ask the question of how much education is really necessary, academic education, and is it going to be suitable for the new age of technology and AI, right? These are very, very different tools. With the arrival of things like ChatGPT, it's more important to ask, to know what questions to ask and how to ask it, rather than to knowing the answers through memorization or these kind of more traditional methods of learning. Um, uh, I think that a lot of the overeducation, being overworked, potentially can suppress a lot of the eventual drive and initiative that children or young people have much later on. They might be burned out earlier on. So it is very difficult thing to answer. At the same time, you have a nation full of highly skilled engineers and data scientists and technical engineers that can tackle some of the high tech industry. So you need both. You need children to be able to unleash their real potential. So at the same time, while they are more intimidating in schools, does that translate into radically different outcomes later on in life? I think is still subject to debate.
As you talk about China taking the next great leap, going from not just an industrial and manufacturing powerhouse, but into becoming a more innovative economy, we can't escape the topic of trade. And one of the big issues that we see in the coming 4 to 5 years is the US China trade tensions. We just saw the re election of President Donald Trump. He won with a clear mandate this time. And we see his priority for America in the coming 4 years is focused on reshoring, putting America first, putting tariffs on other economies. In the short term, it seems that he is going to be putting a lot of damage or a lot of pressure on the Chinese export economy. And I know that the Chinese government has already been paying attention to this, and they've already started the dual circulation efforts, where they focus on both exporting to the world, but also strengthening its consumer economy within China. Does Donald Trump's election accelerate the dual track circulation efforts, or will it be status quo for China? And what would the impact be on the global economy if the coming US China trade tensions?
Donald Trump's isolationist, anti-multilateralist, anti-globalist, desynthesization kind of policies will push China to do two things. One is to seek more partners, other partners, hence kind of diversifying their trading partners, investment partners in Southeast Asia and Europe and so forth, and also to accelerate the reduction in exposure to the U.S. economy, because there's really no choice. And China has already done both since the first trade war, and will really accelerate that trend. If we look at what Chinese companies are doing, they are radically increasing the pace of outward expansion to other geographies and going global. And if we look at China's internal economy, obviously there has been a lot more emphasis on internal absorption. But also we got to understand that there's a lot of trade rerouting going on. It's not going directly to the US, but indirectly through Mexico and Europe and Vietnam and so forth. And what this has done, this US China trade war, is to hurt the US and Chinese economies, but to benefit a number of other economies, uh, including not just Vietnam and Mexico, as we all know, but also Thailand, France, and many others, South Korea, who were able to utilize this additional export platform to do more exporting, not just to the US and China, but to the rest of the world. And that is something we see in the data. Now, is this a good thing? Is this a good strategy? No, I think that if I were a US president or a Chinese president, I want the other country to rely more on my country. So there's more levers, right? But what Donald Trump is doing is to push China to rely less on the US and to rely more on other countries. So there will be fewer levers in the future. This is a dynamic problem, right? And so what we have seen, again, also in the data, is that China has seamlessly, at least what the evidence suggests, shifted away their exports to the US to other countries, right? It wasn't that Chinese exports were substantially eroded and competitiveness eroded, actually just sold to other countries, and cheaper levels that the U.S. would have been would are now receiving, because the American consumers are actually having to pay higher prices. So this is not a good strategy, but we all know that it's not economic, it's politics.
On a side note, I've been seeing a lot more Chinese brands enter into third markets. So, for example, in Singapore, we start to see a lot of the Chinese EV brands setting up shop in Singapore. I saw XPeng open up their showroom recently in Singapore. When I went to Japan, I saw the Chinese electronics brand Haier doing a lot of advertising there as well. Actually, just from a consumer perspective, I could see that China is indeed entering into a lot more third markets. My final question for you is going to be a lot more lighthearted. It's not going to be about trade wars and trade tensions. You're a prof, you're an educator, and I'm sure a lot of students come into your office for office hours asking you for career advice. So naturally, my question would be, what's that one piece of career advice you would give to a fresh grad starting their job?
This is going to make me very unpopular, but first of all, please don't start with the sentence, "My parents think that I should do this, this, and that." Okay, I'm probably going to offend both the parents and the students, but this is a classic line that I often hear. Um, Look, go after your passion and make sure that you're doing something you're really interested in. And no matter what you do, as long as you love it and you do well, you're going to succeed. And whether it's making more money or achieving more recognition, you're going to get it. You're not defined by one kind of profession, and it will make life more fulfilling at a deeper level for a longer period of time if one chooses to do so.
With that sagely advice, thank you, Prof, for coming on.
Great to be with you. Thank you for the interview.
And obviously, I have to plug the book. Everyone, if you have a chance, go and read this book. It's a fantastic read. It will help you understand the changing Chinese economy in today's globalized world.